One thing I frequently talk about on Glass of Water is the fact that YouTube audiences are fickle and sensitive. This isn't their fault, it's the environment that YouTubers themselves have cultivated, and we've all just kind of gotten used to it. We're used to YouTubers being non-confrontational and always peppering their words with praise for the viewer and their opinions. As a result, the knee-jerk reaction to YouTubers who don't do that is to claim that they're too abrasive or too aggressive, or that the message is lost because of the tone. My tone is the thing people complain about the most in my videos, and how it's a lot more aggressive and direct and final than many other YouTubers. I've spoken before about how this is mostly attributed to the aforementioned submissive way that many YouTubers treat their audiences, constantly praising them and never saying anything without a dozen in my opinion qualifiers, condescending to them because they think their audiences are babies who need their hands held. On The Legend of Korra is Garbage and Here's Why, there was no shortage of people saying that the title should include the phrase in my opinion, and I shut them down saying that if you're smart enough to be able to work a computer, then you don't need me to tell you that. But on YouTube, we've all just kind of gotten used to the idea that we'll have different opinions spoon-fed to us in the most digestible and easiest to ignore fashion. We're not used to someone just saying that something is bad and not immediately following it up with, now this is only my opinion, to patronize the audience. Now I know you're probably thinking, why are you bringing this up in an addendum to Blame and Groom? That wasn't some random opinion about a TV show. And you're right, but people treated it like it was anyway. I've said this before, but the attitude you take toward a trivial subject is often going to be the same attitude you take toward a serious subject, especially if you don't view that subject as serious in the first place. Politics is the big one here. A lot of people treat differences of political opinion as if they're the same as differences in movie tastes, but they're almost always the ones who don't have anything to lose from different political opinions. In reality, your political opinions can often imply how little you care about someone. And that's what a lot of people struggle with. A lot of young conservatives who grew up in the era of internet discourse where nothing was taken seriously entered adulthood and couldn't understand why so many people were so angry at them just for having their opinions. And that's because their opinions directly affected other people. They weren't isolated to your own head like your opinions on pineapple pizza are. They have an actual effect on the real world. This is called growing up. Now I know you're probably thinking, well, now you're onto politics, what gives? Remember, this is all connected. None of this exists in a vacuum. People on the internet love to whine about how we need to keep politics out of everything that isn't politics, but politics is the core backbone of our very culture. And culture is where art and entertainment and our belief systems originate from. The big problem is people viewing every opinion as equally credible and also just being an opinion. A key aspect of growing up is realizing that neither of those things are true. And so when you're telling abuse victims that holding onto a grudge is unhealthy and that the path to start healing is forgiveness for your own sake, you're fucking up on two different platforms. Silverquill and Dr. Wolf did exactly this, putting out a video about how people need to forgive Zack for his actions, not for his benefit, but for their own benefit, as a way of starting to heal. Many of the actual victims of Zack's abuse came forward to decry this as gaslighting them to believe that their anger isn't valid and was irrational and self-destructive. Almost everyone in the community has made a public statement about Zack, most of them talking about how he's betrayed their trust, and very few talking about Zack's actual victims. To those that did, and you know who you are, well done. That is the action of someone who cares and who views their own complacency in Zack's behavior as a mistake that needs correcting. Those are the people who will not make this mistake again, and I applaud that. But we're not here to talk about you. We don't need to, you're already doing fine. We're here to talk about this terrible advice given to abuse victims by two of the largest voices in the community. The fact of the matter is, Silverquill and Dr. Wolf have zero experience with abuse, counseling abuse victims, the healing process, or the basic entry-level behavioral psychology that is involved in all of those things. I, on the other hand, have a lot of experience with all of those things. I was abused by my family growing up. I was involved with the mental health field during my own recovery. I spent my late teens and early adulthood involved in youth counseling for a lot of issues from neurodivergence to abuse survivors. I also have a Discord community that has many members involved in it who have dealt with abuse in their lives and are actively involved in the mental health field. Every single claim in this video was fact-checked and debunked multiple times over. When it comes to abuse and healing from abuse, these two know absolutely nothing. They are pulling information directly out of their ass, and they are relying on personal anecdotes and their own spiritual beliefs about how the world should work to gaslight abuse survivors. At first I thought this was well-meaning stupidity, but in light of recent events, I have come to the conclusion that this was genuine malice. Now, I know that's a contentious point. Just hold on, we're going to put a pin in that and we're going to come back to it. First, let's go through why these two are fractally wrong. Silver and Dr. Wolf treat forgiveness as the path toward healing. This is simply not true. Closure is the path toward healing, and closure does not require forgiveness. For many victims of sexual abuse, closure only comes through justice, seeing the person who has wronged you and all their enablers punished for their behavior. Justice is the most satisfying method of closure, but as we've seen, justice cannot be relied on. You have to have faith in the justice system for this to work, and a lot of victims can't have faith in the justice system because it frequently lets their abusers go free. There was a noteworthy moment that blew up on social media of a judge in a sexual abuse case throwing away a letter from a convicted predator that detailed how hard it was to hear his victim's testimony. The reason this was so notable was because that this is the exception and not the rule. It's not uncommon for sexual assault and sexual abuse to be written off as not worth dealing with. Brock Turner got an extremely small sentence for raping an unconscious woman, with his own father writing it off as a few minutes of action. Jade Hatt raped an 11-year-old boy and was defended by the boy's own father, who described his son as sex mad, fully up for it, and said that the son viewed it as a notch in his belt. And those are just the two that immediately sprung to mind. It's rare that a sexual predator is actually punished for their crimes, and even when they are punished, there's no shortage of devil's advocates ready to victim blame. Justice fails abusers more often than it doesn't. And when justice fails you, the only recourse for closure is revenge. The effects of revenge on the healing process have actually been studied, and it has been concluded that revenge is not the terrible, damaging thing many people believe it is. But this is ignored by sanctimonious people who don't think about the functional benefits of anything. Revenge feels wrong, so they condemn it in all its forms. Forgiveness isn't a factor in healing. Sexual abuse victims who do heal often never forgive their abusers, and people in the position to help them heal never suggest that they do so. I helped Patch through the healing process from their abuse at the hands of not only Toon, but their mother. I never suggested that they forgive either of those people, and learning about the abuse they suffered, I reacted with both surprise and disgust. The problem is Silver's own personal definition of forgiveness. Silver personally defines forgiveness as to mend wounds caused by others and then move on with your life. That's not forgiveness. That's moving on. Forgiveness is to cease to feel resentment toward another person for their actions toward you or those you care about, and moving on does not necessarily mean you will forgive someone. Forgiveness has a real, tangible meaning, Silver. You can't just redefine words and then call it your personal definition. That's my opinion doesn't fly here. You are wrong. Period. That leads me to the second problem with Wolf and Silver, and indeed a lot of other people. There's this view, especially on the internet, that anger or resentment is a terrible thing. They won't say those words directly, but when you look at the way they talk about not letting your emotions dominate you and being too emotional to handle this or that conversation, it's clear that they view being calm and meditative as the more rational response. And in a lot of trivial matters, they're right. When talking about abuse, particularly sexual abuse, the opposite is true. Clinically speaking, if someone confides in you that they have been sexually assaulted, the most helpful response is to be surprised and outraged, to jump up and yell, "What the fuck? That's fucked up!" Because a victim needs reassurance, and reacting as if this news is not normal is exactly the reassurance they need. To react calm and meditative is to imply that you are numb to this sort of thing, that it is so common that you are no longer surprised by it. No victim should ever get that feeling. And when confronted about this, many people will say, "Well, I don't mean for it to come across that way." But what you meant doesn't matter. You still did it. That's what your actions have done. Silver and Dr. Wolf may have thought that they were helping people get onto the road of healing, but they know very little about abuse and are drawing from wisdom that they have largely pulled out of their asses. The idea that forgiveness is not a necessity of healing and that remaining angry at someone who has wronged you will not harm you in the long run is such common knowledge that children's shows can grasp it.
You did the right thing. Forgiveness is the first step you have to take to begin healing.
But I didn't forgive him. I'll never forgive him.
Whether they realize it or not, what they've actually done is tell abuse victims to just let it go and get over it. You can't just let that shit go. You can't just drop all your anger and decide not to hold a grudge. Anger doesn't work that way. Anger is as valid of an emotion as fear or joy, and just because you think that anger is irrational doesn't mean that it's actually the case. Abuse victims have a right to be angry at their abusers, and they can't just abandon that anger because someone on the internet who doesn't know what they're talking about thinks it's not healthy. And continuing to strawman and well actually to people who know better will showcase not only how ignorant you are, but how much you are willing to remain ignorant. You remember when I said that Dr. Wolf and Silverquill were being actively malicious? it's time to take that pin out. You see, Sketchy released a video not too long ago talking about their attitude toward forgiveness, and because he mentioned Silverquill's name, Silver was not happy. He complained that Sketchy didn't contact him directly and proceeded to wax poetic about how nobody's talking to each other and everyone is angry. Agreeing with this sentiment, I offered to the both of them to come talk this over with myself, Sketchy, and Patchworkheart. Both of them declined outright, with Silver making a lot of projecting excuses for why it wouldn't work, despite complaining that nobody talks to each other directly. When the offer was made to do exactly that, Silverquill chickened out and started talking about how all of this is a witch hunt against people who have already been hurt by Zack, and how I'm using this situation to slander people out of a personal vendetta, the same usual nonsense he spews whenever he thinks people are being too angry. On one occasion, he says that he's witnessed me rend entire relationships over the past 2 years for reasons he doesn't totally understand, and despite having a wide open opportunity to understand, he turned it down. Now, Silver, if I could talk to you directly, it was one relationship. And the reason it ended was because I eventually discovered that the person involved ultimately had zero respect or regard for me or my well-being, and expected me to listen to his dehumanizing opinions without complaint. It was a toxic relationship that needed to end, and my biggest mistake was not ending it sooner than I actually did. He cares that I ended relationships, but doesn't seem to care enough to figure out why, and actively makes excuses for why he shouldn't talk to me about all of this. As for Dr. Wolf, despite being confronted by an abuse victim and someone with psychiatric experience, he proceeds to ignore their complaints, rewrite all of their arguments to be easier to refute, and gaslighted them with personal anecdotes, including personal stories about his wife that he really had no business sharing with what is effectively a stranger. Silver and Dr. Wolf are two people who hate negativity. All of it, regardless of the context. They look at a situation like this and they see people being angry at one another. They neither know nor care about why people are angry, only that people are angry. So their advice is all about purging people of negativity because they believe that negativity is always bad. When challenged on this, they always talk about clarifying and assuming the person misunderstood them. I didn't. I understood their idea perfectly. The problem isn't that they're unclear. It's that they're wrong. They're giving people advice based entirely on how they think the world works, and when reality contradicts them, they have nowhere to go, and they refuse to learn that their dogmatic rejection of negativity is a harmful one. Remember what we said at the start? The way you approach a trivial topic is a reflection of how you approach a serious topic. These two sugarcoat everything when they talk about My Little Pony, and they sugarcoat everything when talking about abuse. Dr. Wolf himself refuses to say the words sexual predator or pedophilia when talking about Zack. Instead, he says sexually explicit actions with an underage girl. He uses euphemistic language to soften the impact of words where he really shouldn't. And when they're confronted about this, they double down. They can't handle having the real world shoved in their face, so they talk over abuse victims and accuse others of tearing people down in order to build themselves up. A meme that Silver coined in one of his worst videos and has overused ever since. And there's a good chance that Silver's watching this and immediately checking out because I'm being directly negative and calling him by name. But that is his failing, not mine. I tried to talk to him directly about this, and he chickened out. Silver doesn't like to be uncomfortable, and he wants abuse victims to shut up so that he can pretend that things have gone back to normal. And my attitude toward that is tough shit. Silver, you do need to listen to this. You need to absorb it. I don't care how uncomfortable or attacked you feel. You are not a victim in this. Silver has to come to the realization that he fucked this up. And that he fucked this up largely because of his ignorant view of the world and the way negativity affects it. And so far, when confronted on this, his only response has been to deflect and distract, to continue blinding himself to the situation and asserting that the problem is that everyone is angry and nobody is talking to each other, to continue reinforcing the comfortable fantasy that the problem is a lack of friendly discussion in an unfriendly situation. Do you remember a few months ago when I said that the greatest privilege is ignorance? If you have an ounce of privilege in you, you have been Silverquill multiple times in your life, and I promise you that you will be him again. It's the default response to having your privilege checked and being confronted with the fact that you don't know as much about the world as you think you do. If you don't make a conscious effort to be better than him, he is just the path of least resistance. It doesn't help that a lot of their more casual fans and viewers reinforce this idea and make it look like strong wisdom. But notice what the victims are saying. The reaction from Toon's victims has been to either strongly condemn this advice or remark that something about it makes them feel uneasy. And while most of the analysis community got pissy at me for making a very aggressive video about the situation, the victims felt vindicated. They felt like they'd been heard. were assured that they weren't going crazy, and the fact that all of this had gone on for so long was in fact ridiculous, and continuously chose me as the person to confide their stories in. And I made Blame and Groom as aggressive as it was specifically for that reason. I could have been as calm and reasonable as I'm being right here to try and convince the rest of the community to reflect on their behavior. But because the community likes to paint me as someone trying to start trouble and that mean lady who tells people they're wrong, I knew it was going to fall on deaf ears. It doesn't matter how calm I present myself. If I'm directly telling someone in the community that they fucked up, they won't listen because they don't want to. So in the absence of any chance at convincing people, I opted to go for a tone that was vindicating for Toon's victims and emboldened them to come forward in spite of the continued deflection from the community. And it worked. Being outraged in an outrageous situation is the right decision. Trying to force a calm or unemotional attitude to stay comfortable is not. For all the talk Silver spouts about respect, for all the huff he makes about how his and Dr. Wolf's video sends the better message, and in spite of his crying that Mayan Sketchy's videos are attacks, who did the victims thank personally? Who did the victims feel safer talking to about what they went through? You see, in philosophical and psychiatric discussions about abuse, what victims think is the most important thing. But in the immediate fallout of a predator being exposed and everyone who even remotely spoke to them once making public statements, what victims think is the only thing. When victims are thanking you and feeling vindicated, Silver's opinion about how it affects the community doesn't matter. Silver doesn't know what he's talking about, and he demonstrated a stubborn unwillingness to learn. We talk about hindsight being 20/20 and often use that as an excuse for inaction. But hindsight being 20/20 is what makes it so important for Zack's former friends to think back on their behavior, and considering what they could have done differently is how we avoid making those mistakes in the future. Making excuses not to learn only leaves you wide open for a bigger pummeling the next time something like this happens. And in many cases, examining your own behavior is the best thing you can do to help victims of abuse. Because as we've seen demonstrated by Dr. Wolf and Silverquill, if you don't know how to help victims heal, you really should not be trying to do so anyway. You will only do more damage. The best thing to do is to make yourself a more reliable ally. Dr. Wolf, Silverquill, you two fucked up royally. The last thing that victims of abuse need is a sanctimonious lecture based on false morality. The two of you should feel ashamed of yourselves, and you owe every single victim you gaslighted an apology. I'm Lily. Thank you for watching.